Chapter 2. Caroline's been detained. The words remained, blotting out everything else. They were all I could see as I stared uncomprehendingly at Linda. Finally, I managed to speak. There must be some mistake. Caroline's 17. She's in school. She's? I stopped. Started again. What were the circumstances of the detention? Does it matter? Of course it matters. Pulling the notepad closer, my pen already moving, I tried to create structure, some kind of order. Was she formally charged? What statute? Did they provide documentation? Linda shifted from foot to foot. She kept her gaze on the floor. There are protocols for youth detentions, specific review procedures that apply to. Dad. Anyone under 18 requires parental notification within 6 hours, which means you should have received formal paperwork outlining the grounds for detention, the classification code under which she's being held, and the timeline for. Dad, stop. I looked up. Linda stood with her arms wrapped around herself, staring at me like I was speaking a language she'd never learned. I need to understand the technical details, I said carefully. Reasonably. If this is a processing error, and it very likely is, then the fastest route to resolution is through proper administrative channels. I can file an expedited review request. Query the classification. Request documentation audit. These things happen, sweetheart. The system processes thousands of cases daily. Sometimes people get flagged incorrectly. That's why review procedures exist. She wasn't flagged incorrectly. You can't know that without seeing the documentation. I know she was meeting with families from District 7 East. Linda's voice cracked. I know she was helping coordinate shelter placements for people trying to avoid Tuesday's sweep. I know she was carrying photocopied registry documents with restricted classification codes when they picked her up. My pen stopped moving. It dug into the paper in a way I knew meant I'd have to start again on a fresh page. District 7 East. The sweep. The documents. My granddaughter. My careful, quiet, brilliant Caroline who sat at the dining table on Wednesday evenings with papers spread between her and her mother. My daughter. Standing in my study asking about DPM classifications and relocation schedules and armed escorts. Even as I thought it, I believed this should not apply to my family. We were the ones who maintained the system. The responsible class. The administrators who kept everything functioning while the world deteriorated around us. There were people who obeyed the rules and people who broke them, and my family. What classification are they holding her under? The question came out mechanically, as though this were any other case file crossing my desk. I don't know. Then I'll make inquiries. Contact the facility directly. Request status documentation. I was writing now, listing steps. Actions. Things that could be done through proper channels. There are protocols for this. Review boards. Appeal processes. If she was detained without sufficient cause. And if she was detained with sufficient cause. My pen stopped again. Linda stepped closer to the desk. Her voice dropped. Her stare hardened. If the system works exactly as designed, Dad. If the protocols are followed correctly. If the review board examines the evidence and determines that Caroline was, in fact, interfering with lawful registry operations. What then? I looked down at the notepad. At my careful list of administrative remedies. At words like expedited review and appeal process and documentation audit. I looked back up. At my daughter standing across from me, waiting for an answer I didn't have. Dad. I need to know. Her hands gripped the edge of my desk. When the system works perfectly, what happens to Caroline? And I realized I didn't know. After 30 years of processing paperwork, signing authorizations, approving classifications, I had no idea what happened at the end. I had no idea where RT7 actually was. I had no idea what DPM actually meant. Or where those 220 children had actually gone. I'd never asked. I told myself it wasn't my role. Wasn't my responsibility. that the system had divisions of labor for a reason, that you couldn't expect every administrator to understand every component. But now my granddaughter. My chest twinged painfully. I don't know, I said quietly. Linda stared at me. I don't know what the classification means or where RT7 is or what they do there. I don't. I stopped. My hands were shaking again. I don't know. Silence filled the room. Impossibly, Linda's face was even paler than when she'd appeared. You signed the authorizations? Yes. For District 7 East. For the families being relocated? Yes. And you didn't know? Her voice broke. You didn't know what you were authorizing? I knew it was a relocation. I knew the procedural requirements had been met. I knew the signatures were valid and the documentation was. I stopped. Heard how empty it sounded. I verified the process. But not the outcome. That wasn't my responsibility. She laughed. A short, bitter sound. No. Of course not. That wasn't your responsibility. She turned towards the door again. Linda? Don't. She held up her hand without looking back. Just don't. I can still file the review request. For Caroline. There are procedures. Procedures. She said the word like it was poisonous. Yes. There are always procedures, aren't there? Linda, please. The telephone began to ring. Shrill. Insistent. Linda stood frozen by the door. I looked at the telephone. At my daughter. Back to the telephone. It kept ringing. I should. I gestured helplessly at the receiver. Of course. Linda's voice came out flat. You should answer. It might be important. I lifted the receiver. Harker residence. Ronald. My father's voice. Crisp. Authoritative. No preamble. We need to speak about a matter that's come across my desk. Foreboding seized me. Something that had come across his desk this late at night. That my father had to ring me about. I turned slightly, putting my back toward Linda. Lowered my voice. Can this wait until morning? It's rather late, Anne. No. It cannot wait. Papers rustled on his end. I've been reviewing some unusual activity in your district. Query requests that have raised flags. The room seemed to tilt. I gripped the receiver harder. I'm not certain what you're referring to. District 7 East. You submitted an inquiry this evening regarding registry discrepancies. A pause. And facility designation RT7. I'd filed that query less than 2 hours ago. It shouldn't have reached anyone beyond the district coordinator. And definitely not tonight, tomorrow morning at the earliest, maybe. It certainly shouldn't have escalated to my father's level. Unless someone had been watching for precisely that kind of question. It was a routine query, I said carefully. Standard review procedure. The numbers didn't reconcile and I... Ronald. His tone shifted. Not quite threatening. Something worse, disappointed. I'm going to ask you a direct question and I expect a direct answer. Has anyone in your family been in contact with individuals from District 7 East? My father continued before I could respond. There's been some concerning intelligence regarding unauthorized information sharing. Documents with restricted classifications turning up in the wrong hands. Another pause. One individual detained today was carrying photocopied registry materials. A juvenile. Female. 17 years old. Caroline. He knew. Of course he knew. He'd probably known before Linda had. I'm calling as a courtesy, my father said. Family matters, however complicated, should be handled internally when possible. But that courtesy has limits. I glanced at Linda. Her hand was pressed over her mouth. Her eyes were wide and terrified. My father, who'd risen through the regime ranks by prioritizing system loyalty over everything else. Who'd told me repeatedly that sentiment was a luxury we couldn't afford, that hard decisions separated civilization from chaos? My father, who would have his own granddaughter processed without hesitation if he believed the system required it. I understand, I said quietly. Do you? Because I'm not certain you do. Papers rustled again. The query you filed tonight demonstrates a concerning pattern of curiosity about operational details outside your purview. Combined with your granddaughter's activities, it suggests something that requires immediate correction. There's no pattern. I was simply. Performing your duties correctly would mean accepting the information provided rather than questioning classification protocols. His voice hardened. Your role is verification, Ronald. Not investigation. The distinction matters. I said nothing. I was 6 years old again, frozen in fear, waiting for permission to speak. I'm withdrawing your query request. It will not be processed. The District 7 East numbers are correct as filed. A pause. And I'd strongly advise you to have a conversation with your daughter about appropriate boundaries. For everyone's sake. The line went dead. I held the receiver against my ear for another moment before slowly replacing it in the cradle. Linda had known who was calling the moment the telephone rang. Something in my posture, perhaps. The way my shoulders went rigid. Or maybe she'd simply been expecting it. She had known this conversation would happen the instant she walked through my door. Your grandfather, I said. She didn't ask which one. What did he want? I moved to the decanter on the sideboard and stared at it for a long moment before pouring 2 fingers of whiskey. My hands were steadier than they should have been. 30 years of practice, hiding what I felt behind professional composure. He wanted to remind me where the boundaries are. And where are they? I swallowed a mouthful of whiskey. The burn helped. It gave me something to focus on besides the weight in my chest. Closer than I thought. Linda wrapped her arms tighter around herself. She looked small suddenly. Younger. The way she'd looked at 14 when she came home crying because her best friend's family had been relocated. Before she'd learned to hide her feelings, too. Did he tell you Caroline's not cooperating? With the review process. They've asked her questions and she's refused to answer. No, he hadn't told me any of those details. Refused how? She won't tell them who gave her the documents. Won't identify anyone she was meeting with. Won't provide names or locations or. Her voice broke. She's protecting people, Dad. And they're going to make her pay for it. I put the glass down. My daughter was asking me to choose. Between the family I'd proudly watched grow so large, that I loved so much, and the system that kept us all fed and housed and safe. Between the girl who sat at my dining table hiding maps, and the machinery that would grind her to powder if I let it. My father had made that choice decades ago. Had chosen the regime over everything else. Over his siblings who'd questioned the lockdowns. Over cousins who'd spoken too loudly about disappeared neighbors. Over me, probably, if I ever forced him to pick. He'd survived by cutting away the diseased tissue before it could spread. I'd spent 30 years telling myself I was different. That I could protect my family and serve the system. That there was space for both loyalties if I was careful enough, clever enough, quiet enough. The telephone call had been clear. That space had disappeared. How long do we have? I asked. Linda's head came up. Hope flickered across her face. Until Tuesday. The sweep. For days. I thought of the authorization form sitting in my archive box. Of the 220 children who'd vanished from the registry. Of my careful notes and careful questions and careful ignorance about where any of it led. I can't stop the sweep, I said. I don't have that authority. The hope died. Then what? But I might be able to delay it. Create complications. Administrative tangles that need resolving before the operation proceeds. I was thinking aloud now, running through possibilities. If the facility designation gets flagged for review. If questions emerge about capacity calculations or processing protocols. If someone with sufficient rank requests clarification. Would that work? It would buy time. Maybe a week. Maybe less. I met her gaze. What would you do with a week? She understood what I was asking. What I was offering. Not rescue. Just delay. Time for whatever network she'd gotten tangled in to move people, hide them, get them somewhere the sweep couldn't reach. The next morning, I arrived at the regional administration building at 7:20, earlier than usual, but not so early as to draw attention. The security guard at the entrance nodded as I swiped my identification card. Thompson. We'd exchanged pleasantries about the weather every morning for 6 years. The building was nearly empty at this hour. A few cleaners moved through the corridors with their trolleys. The ventilation system hummed. My footsteps on the marble floors echoed in a way they never did during normal hours, when the space was filled with voices and movement and the beeps of office equipment. I took the stairs rather than the lift. I needed the time to think things through. For days to create enough administrative chaos to delay a sweep that had already been authorized, processed, and scheduled. For days to protect families I'd never met from a system I'd spent 3 decades serving. For days to save my granddaughter from consequences I still didn't fully understand. And I had to do it without leaving a trace. My office was on the 3rd floor, at the end of a corridor lined with identical doors, each one marked with a nameplate and a departmental designation. Mine read, Ronald Harker, Senior Review Administrator, Regional Population Coordination. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The space was exactly as I'd left it yesterday, with a desk clear except for the brass lamp and telephone. Filing cabinets lined the left wall, each drawer labeled with date ranges and classification codes, while the bookshelf on the right held procedure manuals and regulatory updates spanning 30 years. The window behind my desk overlooked the central courtyard, a stretch of bare concrete with a few struggling shrubs that the maintenance staff kept threatening to remove. I hung my coat on the stand by the door and sat down. For a moment I simply stared at the empty desk surface. At the careful blankness of it. I'd always prided myself on maintaining a clean workspace. Processing documents efficiently, filing them properly, never letting work accumulate. The visible manifestation of an orderly mind. Now it was merely camouflage concealing who knew what dubious things. I pulled open the bottom drawer and removed this week's incoming authorization folder. 23 pending approvals. I'd planned to work through them this morning before the weekly coordination meeting at 10. Instead, I pushed the folder aside and reached for the internal directory. Facility operations was located on the 5th floor. The directory listed a main office number and 3 extension codes for senior staff. I didn't recognize any of the names. That division had been restructured 2 years ago, part of a wider reorganization I'd barely noticed at the time. New management. New protocols. New reporting chains that didn't intersect with mine. I picked up the telephone receiver, then put it down again. Calling directly would create a record, a logged inquiry from my extension to theirs, timestamped and traceable. If anyone reviewed communication logs later, and they would, if this went wrong, that connection would stand out. Better to visit in person. A casual conversation. No documentation. I locked my office and took the stairs to the 5th floor hoping they'd be early workers, too. The corridor was identical to mine. Same marble floors, fluorescent lighting, same row of anonymous doors. But the atmosphere felt different. Quieter. More austere. The main facility operations office was halfway down the corridor. I straightened my tie, checked my identification was visible on my lapel, and knocked. Come in. The woman behind the desk looked in her early 40s, with her hair pulled back severely. Reading glasses hung from a chain around her neck. Her nameplate read, Susan Fletcher, Administrative Coordinator. She glanced up from her computer screen. Can I help you? Ronald Harker. Regional Review Administration. I kept my voice pleasant. I'm terribly sorry to bother you so early, but I'm trying to track down some information about a facility designation that's come up in one of my reviews. Her expression didn't change. What sort of information? Operational details, capacity specifications, processing protocols. The designation is RT7. I smiled apologetically. It's not one I'm familiar with, and I can't seem to locate it in the standard facility directory. RT7. She turned back to her computer and typed something. Frowned. That's an unusual request. Is it? I understood RT facilities were standard regional transfer centers. They are. But RT7 is classified as a priority processing facility. Information about those isn't typically distributed to review administrators. She looked at me more carefully. May I ask why you need this information? My stomach roiled, but I kept my face straight. I'm reviewing a relocation authorization that references RT7 as the destination facility. Standard verification procedure. I like to confirm that capacity allocations align with facility specifications before I approve large-scale transfers. The authorization has already been approved, hasn't it? Yes, of course. This is for my own records. Quality assurance. It helps prevent complications later if all the details are properly verified up front. She studied me for a moment before picking up her telephone. Let me check with my supervisor. Oh, there's no need to bother anyone. If the information isn't readily available, I can always. It's no bother. Mr. Patterson? Yes, good morning. I have Ronald Harker from Regional Review here. He's asking about RT7 facility specifications. A pause. Yes. All right. I'll let him know. She hung up. Mr. Patterson says that information requires Level 3 clearance. You'd need to submit a formal request through your departmental supervisor. I see. How long does that typically take? 7 to 10 business days for approval. Longer if there are questions about the justification. 2 weeks. Far too long. Thank you for checking. I smiled again. I'll go through the proper channels. Is there anything else I can help you with? No, that's all. Thank you for your time. I left before she could ask any more questions. Back in the corridor, I stood for a moment letting my heart rate settle. That hadn't worked. Worse, I'd created a record of my interest in RT7. Susan Fletcher would remember this conversation. If anyone asked her later about unusual inquiries, my name would come up. That was stupid, clumsy. I should have thought it through more carefully before approaching her. I returned to the stairwell, but instead of going down to my office, I climbed up to the 6th floor. Records and archives occupied the 6th floor. I'd been up here dozens of times over the years, retrieving files for audits or compliance reviews. The head archivist, Gerald Morris, had worked here longer than I'd been with the department. He knew the filing system better than anyone. Rows and rows of filing cabinets and document storage boxes, overseen by a skeleton staff of archivists who processed the constant flow of paperwork the regime generated. Everything was duplicated here. Every authorization form, compliance report, population transfer order. The official record of the system's operation. The system did not trust a single record. Digital files could be altered, corrupted, or erased. Paper required effort, access, and risk. Every movement in this building was recorded. Gerald was at his desk, sorting through a stack of documents. He looked up when I entered. Ronald. This is early for you. Thought I'd get a head start on the week. I gestured at the rows of cabinets behind him. I need to pull some historical files. District 7 East population records. Last 2 quarters. Gerald retrieved a key ring from his drawer. Any particular classification? General population data. Registry totals, transfer authorizations, that sort of thing. Should be in Section C. I'll show you. We walked through the narrow aisles between filing cabinets. The overhead lights flickered, casting wavery shadows across the grey metal surfaces. The air smelled of old paper and dust. Gerald stopped at a cabinet marked District 6 to 8, Q1 Q2 2026 and unlocked it. District 7 East should be about halfway through. Help yourself. Just make sure you sign the retrieval log when you're finished. Will do. Thank you, Gerald. He nodded and returned to his desk. I pulled open the drawer and began flipping through the hanging folders. Each one was labeled with a district code and date range. I found 7 East Q1 and removed it, then located Q2 behind it. I carried both folders to one of the small desks set up for document review and sat down. The Q1 file was thin. Routine monthly population reports. Birth registrations. Mortality records. A handful of voluntary relocation requests, all approved without complications. Nothing unusual. Q2 was thicker. I opened it and began working through the documents. April's population report showed the same baseline I'd seen before, 1,847 registered dependents aged 0 to 12. May's report showed 1,851, a modest increase consistent with birth registrations. Then June. The population report listed 1,604 dependents. The same figure I'd seen in my office 2 nights ago. But this file contained something mine hadn't, supporting documentation. 3 separate relocation authorizations, filed over the course of the month. The first was dated June 3, destination, RT4. Capacity, 47 units. Classification, standard residential transfer. I recognized RT for a regional housing facility about 50 miles west. This looked routine. The second date stopped me, June 14th. I knew this authorization. I'd signed it 3 weeks ago. I'd approved it in under 4 minutes because Margaret's sister was coming for dinner and I'd been conscious of the time. Destination, RT7. Capacity, 190 units. Classification, DPM Priority Standard. But now, looking at the full document rather than just the summary sheet I'd seen in my office, I noticed other things. The authorization included an attachment. A supplementary form labeled Special Processing Protocol, Attachment A. I turned to the attachment. It was a single page, dense with bureaucratic language. Instructions for transportation arrangements. Security requirements. Processing timelines. And at the bottom, a section titled Final Disposition Protocols. I read it 3 times before my mind accepted what it was saying. Upon completion of processing procedures, all units designated DPM are to be transferred to permanent holding per Protocol 7A. Transportation to secondary facilities will be arranged through central logistics. Registry records should be updated to reflect final status classification, DPMF. No family notification required for DPM classifications. Registry adjustments will be processed as administrative corrections. Permanent holding. Final status classification. No family notification required. The words swam in front of me. I gripped the edge of the desk and blinked hard to make them come back into focus. 190 children. Gone. Not relocated. Not transferred to another district or facility. Just processed. Filed away. Reduced to an administrative correction in the registry records. And I'd signed it. My signature was at the bottom of the authorization form. My name carefully scribed. My administrator code. The date stamp confirming I'd reviewed and approved the transfer. I'd sent 190 children to permanent holding without asking what that meant. I pressed my hand over my mouth and breathed carefully through my nose until a sudden wave of nausea passed. After a moment, I looked at the third authorization. Dated June 28, destination, RT7. Capacity, 63 units. Classification, DPM Priority Standard. Another attachment. The same Special Processing Protocol. The same Final Disposition language. 63 more children. 253 children. But the discrepancy in the population report was only 220. I flipped back through the birth registrations. Found 41 new registrations in Q2. The mathematics resolved themselves with horrible clarity. The missing children weren't just the ones who'd been relocated. They included the ones who'd been born during the quarter. Infants who'd been registered in April or May and then vanished by June. Never given a chance to what? Grow up? Go to school? Exist? The sense of doom I had kept at bay all night closed over me, heavy and absolute.